All right, so Chapter 9 gives us a pretty good overview, 401k plans. We'll look at these. We're going to mostly consider those 401k plans that are qualified, and they by definition they have to be qualified with a couple of exceptions. Look at qualified, and we're also going to focus more on those that are defined contribution. Okay, so that's kind of where we're going to be living today for Chapter 19, and there are a couple of exceptions to those, but that's kind of where I want your mindset to be when we're talking about 401k plans. Okay. All right. So it is qualified. It is often some type of sharing plan. Okay, and this could be investments, but it's a qualified plan. And the primary things that it offers up to $9,500 as of 2020. So moving in, as of 2020, $19,500 that you or an employee can store away. It's tax deferred. If it's not a Roth, it's tax deferred. And oftentimes, with the contribution plans here, we see a couple of types of matching. We can see a straight match, we can see formula matching, so 50% up to 6%, be an example of that. And the interest that the employee accrues is not taxed when it accrues. So the taxes only come upon withdrawal for these. So you get tax-free interest accruals, and you get to defer the taxes on that income. Now, when is it a good use or good idea for an employer to use this? Or if you're a government job, then it's a bit different. But outside of that, if you want to provide a low expense retirement plan, in fact, it's so low expense, I mentioned it twice here, low expense and minimal expense, so very inexpensive, relatively speaking. You're okay with meeting the minimum funding requirements that we'll discuss in a bit. But it's also attractive because it's kind of like a savings, but it gives the employee the choice to utilize it. So that's kind of good for you because as an employer, you can estimate the maximum amount if you are matching. If you're matching, you can estimate the maximum amount you're going to have to put in for each employee. And dollars to donuts, no one's going, or very few people are going to meet that match. Not everyone will, of course. So, but you can get a maximum probable expense based just on that. Some of the other ways that we could look at this, okay, for the employee side, they get that choice. So there's some uncertainty for the employer, but again, there's a maximum cap on that. We only match so much. So we get this choice element, and unfortunately, a lot of people choose not to use it, but there you go. And some people can't utilize it. But these are better the younger the employee is. These are better the younger the employee is because you have more time to save up and store up those cash reserves. Younger here being definitely sub 30, but ideally sub 35 or sub 40. There's some degree of investment risk. So what happens with this, the mechanics, the employer offers a 401k, and there will be a vendor or some vendors like Fidelity or Vanguard that hold the cash, usually collectively, and invest based on the employee's choice. So if you have a 401k, you could sign into Fidelity. Okay, it's through your employer, sign into Fidelity and say, okay, well, I want to allot my investments as such. Now, there are some limitations, and in fact, 401ks tend to be a little more limited than a standard IRA or individual retirement account. Regardless, there's some investment risk here. So let's kind of codify a bit more these advantages and disadvantages. So we get this tax-deferred retirement savings, the exception of Roth. There are Roth 401ks, 403bs, 457bs. There are Roth variants of all those accounts. You get that element of choice for the employee. And the employer has a choice on whether they want to match and how they want to match. Now, there's a cap on deduction. It's 25% of payroll. So definitely have to keep that in mind. Because you get to deduct this as an expense too as the employer. But most of the funding, so if you are paying that vendor, you could pass the fee on to the employee, just a little bit, or all of it. So the vendor fee. And some plans offer hardship withdrawals. So maybe for a few years you can put 15 or 20 or more percent into that 401k. Nice little nest egg for retirement, and then you have a bad year. A hardship could be financial, could be medical. You can withdraw with limited penalty before you retire. And we'll cover that. Okay, so that sounds nice. Well, what's the flip side though? What's the flip side? If you enter in at a later period, this may not be adequate. If you're a higher earner and start later, so example would be a medical doctor. You go through residency for quite some time, and you may be in your early to mid-30s before you really start working. You'll command a high salary, high debt usually, but you'll command a high salary, but you won't get started until your mid-30s. And even $20,000 or $19,500 for 30 years might not make up for your income once you retire. Because again, you have a higher income, significantly higher income than average, but you start at a later date, so it might not be enough because of this limitation here. If you're over 50, you can do up to 26,000, so you have an additional 6,500. So you can do that. But it still might not be enough, because if you want to retire in 15 years, saving back $25,000, $26,000 a year, even at a good return of, let's say, 8 or 9%, might not be enough. But it depends on your needs as an individual. And then employees do have that risk. So it's not all butterflies and rainbows. There are some cons to it. Now, basic design features that we'll go through here, how the salary reductions work, the types of employer contribution plans that we'll see. We'll go through 4 of those. And you'll see 2 examples of those on the worksheet as well. How the plans distribute. Generally at retirement, we could say after 59 and a half, but there are hardship withdrawals too to consider. And once we finish that, we'll have a little comparison at the end to other retirement accounts for this. All right, so what about salary reductions? So this is kind of or where these plans are focused on, the primary really advantage. It's like, all right, well, if I put aside $5,000 or $10,000 or 5 or 10%, whatever it may be, if I want to match that employer matching, if I do that now, I'm not paying taxes on it. Okay, so there's a tax advantage. Okay, if my marginal tax rate is 30%, and I put in $5,000 pre-tax, I have a $1,500 tax advantage during that year. So I don't have to pay that. Okay. Whereas otherwise I would at that marginal rate. And this does depend on the margin that you're at, your income. Now, it would be nice as an employer if we could just say, hey, you have to pay in on this as soon as you hit the ground running, day one. We're taking out of your paycheck, right? Because we kind of have to fund it too. If we do that, employees must always be able to opt out. And employees can actually change how much is that taken out of their gross salary, how much they contribute. By law, they can do that once per year. So if I set mine back in August, next enrollment period, next August, I can do that again. It could be this set on a full year, so it could be that I could do it in January, it depends how it's set up. But you get one per enrollment period, which has to be calendar year. The employee always has, I guess I could say access. They always own what they put in. If you put in that $5,000, it is yours. Any losses or gains that you see on that portion is yours. But we've discussed vesting a bit. You may not always be privy to what the employer puts in. You've been there for 6 years by law, you do get all of that. So if you have a 4-year even vesting schedule, then you get 25% each year. After the 4th year, you have 100%. So yours plus the percentage that you've earned through your tenure. So there'll be a problem or two based on vesting in the worksheet as well. Cliff vesting, so we have a 3-year cliff vesting, that means you get 0, 0, 0, and after the 3rd year, 100%. Why would an employer want to stretch it out? Well, we covered that last week. Helps with retention. They know that they don't get portions of their, any plan, pension or 401k or whatever it may be. They don't get a portion of it until 6 years. They're probably going to stay with you. If this is their 4th or 5th year, they're probably going to stick with you for another year or two. So it can help with retention. Now, some of the ways that we can see, so we'll say this is a contribution type plan, defined contribution. The most common is formula matching. Okay, so formula matching. Now, as of this year, I'm going to check my stats here. I think I know it off the top of my head. I do, yes. All right, as of this year, the most common percentage match, so ignoring what the formula may be, the most common, the median percentage match is 4.5%. Okay? So that's the median, 4.5%. The most common formula matching is 50% of every dollar up to 6% of employee salary. So the average, just percentage match is 4.5%. Okay, but the most common formula match is 50% up to 6%. Which will be, that will be an average of what? 3%, right? If you utilize all of it, it'd be an average of 3%. So I tell that to you because you might see it in the future, but also, so if you're looking at jobs and you're comparing, that gives you a fair benchmark. So that's formula matching. Discretionary matching just varies every year. Could be based on, performance, but usually we would see profit sharing for that. So if we had a good year, revenues hit a certain benchmark, then we have $100,000 that we're just going to contribute evenly to every employer based on their salary proportion. So if you make 5% of total payroll, that's what you make, then you're getting $5,000 put through your 401k. So that can be good to incentivize. Whereas a good formula matching plan just encourages the employees to put in and can help fund, but it might not be directly tied to firm performance. And then finally, not quite as common, but definitely easy to understand, formula contribution. So we're going to give you 3%, you don't have to match. Right, so you make $100,000 a year, they give you $3,000 every year into your 401k. Whether you put $1 in, or you max that, or you put in the max $19,500. And I do want to make a quick note that $19,500 is just for the employee. Okay. Doesn't include employer contributions. I don't think I mentioned that when we were going through it, maybe last week. So that's just for the employee. So if they're matching up to half of that, then you'll be sitting pretty sweet around $28,000, $29,000 a year saving. That seems pretty good, but we don't know how much you make, so that might not be enough. If you make $500,000 a year, that probably isn't enough. If you make less than $250,000, that's probably enough. But we don't know. Incomplete information. So for example, when you're looking at Ball State's plan, they have a 403B that they contribute 5% to. Employees don't contribute. So that's pretty nice. without knowing anything else about it, that's better than the average formula matching or the average percentage matching. Because with those, you have to contribute to get them. With something like this, you don't have to contribute. You just get 5%. What's even more impressive is that after the third year, they move up to 10.5%. That's one of the best retirement plans I've seen. Whether I put a dime in there or not. Now, distributions, payout. You retire, you get it. Retire after adequate age. You pass away, you have a beneficiary name, then they get that. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're able to cash it out without penalty. Depends. And if you have severe disability, okay, or terminal illness, and a hardship withdrawal is just not enough. Some plans is just if you leave the employer, but oftentimes you have to roll that over into another retirement account. You don't have access to all the funds and then just pay the taxes. You have access, you pay a 10% penalty, and then you pay the taxes. Example. So what are these hardships? What are some examples of hardships? Anything that we can argue is necessary and immediate from a financial perspective. If I cannot get funds anywhere else, and I'm going to lose my home, or have terminal illness, so I can't receive the money anywhere else, is immediate and necessary need. So a couple of examples here. All right, so what's happening on kind of the investment side of things, right? It's not like you're putting that money and it's just sitting. That doesn't help you, especially if we know that those interest gains are not taxed as you're gaining them. So what's really going on here? Usually there's a secondary vendor. Right. But what kind of choice do we have in these investments? For qualified plans, the choices tend to be a bit limited if it's a qualified plan. But it's all pooled, there's a vendor, and each employee gets some choice in how they want to invest. If you do even more direct investment, so if it's really that the employees choose almost every little aspect about it, that increases the plan cost, and therefore the fees, which cuts in on your yearly return. But some employees like that. So it'd be bonds, it could be even government, it could be T-bills, be very, very safe. But mostly liquid, but see some gain. Any year-to-date average over 10% doesn't generally happen. So not too risky. A few variants here. We've mentioned the Roth. So in this case, if you want to put $5,000 in on this, it's going to be $5,000 after you're taxed. So there's no immediate tax advantage, no deferral, but the interest still accrues in the same way. So you can have a Roth IRA, Roth 401k, 403b, 457b. There are Roth variants of each of those plans. The good thing about a Roth 401k compared to a Roth IRA is that there are no income limitations. So Roth IRA, if you make more than $139,000, you can't do it. You have to do what's called a backdoor Roth IRA, which is the exact same thing. So you kind of wonder why there's a limitation to begin with, but there you go. But that's extra paperwork, a little more time. Whereas if your employer offers a 401k, it doesn't matter how much you make. And we'll talk more about the limits for standard IRAs in the next chapter. A simple 401k, so savings incentive match plan for employees. Savings incentive match plan for employees. These are good for smaller firms, and they're also exempt from some discriminatory offerings. So discrimination here is not in the traditional social construct, it just means discrimination across your employees. So the 401k plan, you have to offer that to most, if not all, of your employees. Part-time's a little different, but all your full-time employees you have to offer. Simple 401k, not always the case. And up until now, these have all been defined contribution. And 0% is still a defined contribution. But you can also have defined benefit plans, DBK. It's a type of 401k. These are not utilized too much. These are kind of pushed 5 to 10 years ago. I have not really ever dealt with any or seen any. But we haven't seen as many pension plans because they're harder to fund and more expensive for the employer. So this is kind of a push for that. I don't know if it's really come to fruition, but there you go. All right. Again, this is a rehash, I believe, but employee deferrals up to the annual limit are not taxed, so that $19,500. So you could store away $19,500 and then another $6,000 in an IRA for a little more than $25,000, and you are not taxed on that either, and it accrues interest. Not many people are able to do that. Just forget about $25,000, but some can. There's the option there, and that's ignoring employer contributions. And deferrals are subject to all the regulations we've covered up to this point. All right, questions about 401k plans?